The heat was a living thing, roaring, licking, consuming the night. Alara ran, her bare feet slapping on the packed earth path, the ground unervingly warm beneath them. Ash rained down, gritty and acrid, catching in her throat and stinging her eyes. Behind her, Harmony Creek was the inferno. The general store, the boarding house where she'd scraped by, the livery stable, all collapsing into a pyre against the bruised, smoke-choked sky. The screams had faded, replaced by the monstrous crackle and roar of the fire devouring timber and hope. She had nothing. The small coin purse, the worn shawl, the locket with her mother's miniature gone, swallowed by the sudden, greedy flames that had erupted from the bakery less than an hour ago. She hadn't even stopped to think, just fled the oppressive heat and the terrifying sound, joining the panicked stream of people until she was alone, running into the featureless blackness beyond the town limits. Panic was a cold knot in her belly, a stark contrast to the inferno behind her. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone, with the world reduced to the sound of her ragged breath and the distant, dying roar of the fire. She stumbled, falling to her knees, scraping her palms on sharp gravel hidden beneath the ash. Tears, hot and useless, tracked paths through the grime on her face. Where could she go? The nearest town was days away on foot, through country she didn't know. She had no food, no water, no shelter, and the air was growing heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness that spoke of a coming change in the weather. The wind that had fanned the flames died abruptly. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of rain and distant lightning. She pushed herself up, her muscles trembling with exhaustion and fear. The orange glow behind her began to fade, replaced by an even more profound darkness. The sky, moments before choked with smoke, was now bruised and angry with thunderheads gathering with alarming speed. A low rumble vibrated through the ground, not from the fire, but from the approaching storm. It was exchanging one threat for another, from the immediate searing destruction to a slower, biting exposure. She had chosen the unknown wilderness over the certainty of incineration, but the wilderness was unforgiving. She walked blindly, following the faint track of the road, or what she hoped was the road, her eyes straining to pierce the oppressive blackness. The first fat drops of rain hit the parched earth, kicking up dust. Then more. Then a sudden, violent deluge. The rain was not gentle. It was a furious assault, cold and heavy, instantly soaking her thin dress and chilling her to the bone. Within minutes, she was drenched, shivering uncontrollably. The path became a muddy stream, treacherous underfoot. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the desolate landscape in stark, fleeting flashes, gnarled trees, jagged rocks, empty, unforgiving land stretching in every direction. Each flash revealed her isolation, emphasized her vulnerability. She pressed on, driven by a primal urge to find shelter, any shelter, before the storm broke her entirely. The thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that made her cry out and stumble again. The wind whipped her hair around her face, stinging her eyes. The cold was seeping into her bones, promising hypothermia. She thought of the warmth of the fire, the terrifying beauty of its destruction, and felt a perverse longing for its quick end compared to this slow, miserable assault by the elements. But she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, a desperate, animal instinct for survival her only guide. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stop, couldn't lie down in the mud and surrender. The image of the burning town, the faces she would never see again, fueled a frantic energy. She had survived that. She had to survive this. Her mind felt distant, detached from the raw physical misery. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Her limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. She stumbled yet again, falling hard this time, landing in a puddle that felt like ice water. For a moment, she just lay there, the rain beating down on her face, the mud sucking at her dress. It would be so easy to stop, to let the cold claim her. But a flicker of stubborn defiance, small but persistent, ignited within her. She wouldn't let the fire take everything, not even her will to live. Pushing herself up took a monumental effort. She could barely feel her fingers. She needed shelter, desperately. She scanned the landscape during the next flash of lightning, her eyes darting frantically. Rocks, trees, more empty land. Then, faintly, through the sheets of rain, a darker shape against the slightly less dark background. It was small, indistinct, but it wasn't nature. It was man-made. It had to be a cabin, a shack, anything. A spark of hope, fragile as spun glass, flickered in her chest. She changed direction, stumbling towards the shape, her focus narrowed to that single point of potential salvation. The distance was uncertain, but the possibility pulled her forward. Each step was agony, her wet clothes clinging to her like a shroud, the mud dragging at her feet. The wind howled around her, trying to push her back, but she leaned into it, driven by that faint hope. The shape grew slowly, resolving into the rough outline of a small cabin, low to the ground, looking battered but solid against the storm's fury. There was no light in the window, no welcoming glow, but it was shelter. It was walls and a roof between her and the raging elements. She reached it, collapsing against the rough-hewn logs, gasping for breath. Her hands fumbled for a door latch, her fingers stiff and numb. There was a simple wooden door. She found the handle, cold and smooth under her touch, and pushed. It groaned open a crack. Inside was blackness, silent and still save for the roar of the storm outside. She hesitated for only a second. The choice was stark, the certainty of freezing to death in the storm or the uncertain welcome within. Survival instinct won. She slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind her, plunging herself into a darkness so profound it felt absolute. The air inside was cold, but blessedly still. The sound of the storm was muffled, reduced to a roar against the walls and the drumming on the roof. She leaned against the door, her body trembling uncontrollably. She was inside. She was safe from the rain and wind, for now. But she was still a stranger, alone, in a dark cabin she knew nothing about. The air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke, stale cooking, and something else. Something that hinted at occupancy, not abandonment. She held her breath, listening. Silence. Only the storm outside. She stayed pressed against the door, giving her eyes time to adjust to the deep gloom. Slowly, vague shapes began to emerge. A table, chairs, the dark shape of a fireplace. Still no sign of life. Perhaps it was empty, or perhaps the occupants were deep sleepers, undisturbed by a frantic stranger stumbling in from a hurricane. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Trespassing was a serious offense, but staying outside was death. She sank to the floor, huddling against the door, trying to make herself small and invisible in the overwhelming darkness. Her wet clothes were a heavy, freezing weight. Shivers racked her body. She needed warmth desperately. She needed to dry off, to find a corner away from the damp seeping in. But she was afraid to move, afraid to make a sound that might reveal her presence to whoever might be sleeping here. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to generate heat, but it was useless. The cold was too deep. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her, trying to remember warmth, trying to conjure the image of the fire not as a terrifying destroyer, but as a source of heat. But even that image was tainted with the screams and the smell of burning. She was adrift, anchored only by the fragile walls of this cabin. She must have drifted into a state of semi-consciousness, somewhere between sleep and freezing. The cold was absolute, a biting pain in her extremities, a dull ache in her core. A sound jolted her awake. Not the storm, which had lessened its immediate fury, though it still drummed against the cabin. It was a soft, human sound, a child's whimper, followed by a low, gruff voice. Alara froze, every muscle tightening. Someone was here. She had stumbled into an occupied home. The whimpering came again, closer this time, followed by the creak of floorboards. A figure moved in the darkness, tall and broad. She held her breath, pressing herself tighter against the door. The figure stopped. There was a long moment of absolute silence, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain. She could feel eyes on her, even in the darkness. The air thickened with unspoken tension. Then, slowly, deliberately, a match scraped. A small flame flared, casting dancing shadows. It was held by a man, silhouetted against the growing light. He held a small lamp, its wick not yet fully lit, casting a dim, flickering glow that barely pushed back the darkness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a rough, unshaven face partially obscured by shadow. His eyes, though, were clear and sharp, fixed directly on her huddled form by the door. Next to him, peering around his leg, were two small figures, children, their faces pale and wide-eyed in the uncertain light. One sniffled quietly. Alara couldn't speak. Her throat felt tight and used. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of exhaustion and cold. She was caught. She looked like a drowned rat, covered in mud and ash, a complete stranger who had just broken into their home. What would he do? Turn her back out into the storm? Accuse her? The man said nothing for a long moment, just held the lamp, his gaze steady, assessing. The smaller child, a boy with tangled hair, whimpered again and pressed closer to the man's leg. The other child, a girl, older than the boy but still small, just stared, her expression unreadable. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and rough, devoid of obvious emotion. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was not overtly threatening, but it held a weight of weary caution. Alara tried to answer, but only a raw, cracked sound escaped. She cleared her throat, the action painful. "Alara," she managed, her voice a thin whisper. "From Harmony Creek." She couldn't bring herself to say, "the fire." It felt too raw, too final. His eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Harmony Creek. News traveled slowly out here, but it traveled. Had he heard? Did he know about the fire? About who she might be, or who people might think she was? He didn't press. He simply nodded slowly, still observing her. "How'd you get here?" he asked. "Walked," she said, stating the obvious, her voice gaining a little strength. "The storm. I needed shelter." She gestured vaguely towards the door, towards the sound of the rain, the gesture weak and trembling. He looked from her to the children, then back to her. The silence stretched again, heavy with his unspoken decision. The girl nudged his leg softly. The man sighed, a quiet sound that seemed to carry the weight of the night. He didn't say "get out," he didn't call her a trespasser. Instead, he gestured with the lamp towards the center of the room, towards the dark fireplace. "Come away from the door," he said, his voice still quiet. "You're dripping everywhere." It wasn't a welcoming invitation, more a practical command, but it was an offer of sorts, a grudging acceptance of her presence, temporary though it might be. Alara hesitated, unsure if she could even move. Her limbs felt stiff, locked by cold and fear. But the thought of warmth, of getting out of her soaking clothes, was a powerful motivator. She pushed herself up. Every movement ached. Mud splattered on the floor. She shuffled forward slowly, keeping her eyes on the man and the children. The older child shrank back slightly as she approached, pressing closer to the man. The man himself didn't move, just watched her come, holding the lamp steady. As she moved into the faint light, she could see him more clearly. He looked tired, his face etched with lines that spoke of hardship and solitude. His clothes were plain, practical, worn. He looked like he belonged to this rough land, carved from it. The children huddled beside him, watching her with wide, wary eyes. "There's some dry blankets by the hearth," he said, indicating a pile of dark fabric near the fireplace. "Take 'em. Get those wet things off before you catch your death." His tone was still neutral, practical, but the instruction was clear. He wasn't going to throw her out. Not tonight, at least. She reached the hearth, her legs shaky. The blankets felt rough but blessedly dry under her fumbling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He didn't reply, just turned slightly, shielding the children from her gaze while still keeping an eye on her. The older child, the girl, had long, dark braids. The boy had a smudge of dirt on his cheek. They looked young, vulnerable. She realized the man was likely a widower, raising these children alone out here. The thought softened her fear slightly, replacing it with a different kind of understanding. Shared hardship, even if unspoken, created a strange sort of common ground. She turned her back to them, fumbling with the buttons on her wet dress with stiff fingers. It was a slow, awkward process, made more difficult by the shaking that still racked her body. The rough wool blankets felt like heaven as she wrapped them around herself, shedding the heavy, mud-soaked fabric. She folded the wet dress and laid it on the stone hearth, hoping it might dry eventually. She remained wrapped in the blankets, a huddled shape by the cold fireplace, acutely aware of their presence behind her. She felt exposed, vulnerable despite being covered. The man finally moved, walking softly across the floor. He stirred the ashes in the fireplace, added a few small pieces of kindling, then a larger log. Soon, a small flame flickered to life, casting a warm, golden glow into the room. It was a different kind of fire than the one she had fled, smaller, controlled, offering warmth and light instead of destruction. He stood back, watching the fire catch. He didn't offer her food or a place to sleep beyond the floor she was on, but he had given her shelter from the storm and warmth from the cold. It was more than she had a right to expect. The children had retreated behind him again, only their eyes visible as they watched her from the shadows. The fire grew stronger, chasing away the deepest shadows and bringing a welcome warmth to the small cabin. Alara remained huddled by the hearth, wrapped in the scratchy wool blankets, watching the flames. The man had quietly fetched more wood and banked the fire before retreating to a different part of the cabin, where she could hear the soft sounds of him settling the children back to sleep. They were in a small loft, accessed by a wooden ladder she hadn't noticed in the darkness. The children's quiet breathing eventually mingled with the sounds of the dying storm outside, creating a fragile sense of peace within the cabin walls. She didn't sleep. Exhaustion was a heavy weight, but her mind was too restless, too filled with the images of the fire and the uncertainty of her situation. She watched the fire, letting its warmth seep into her chilled bones. She was a trespasser here, an unwelcome guest thrust upon this family by circumstance. She owed them, and the debt felt heavy. As dawn approached, the sky outside the small window squares lightened from black to a bruised gray. The rain had stopped, though water still dripped from the eaves. The world outside looked clean, scrubbed raw by the storm. The man came down from the loft as the first pale light filtered into the cabin. He moved with quiet efficiency, careful not to wake the children. He didn't look at her directly at first, busying himself with rekindling the fire and starting a pot of coffee over the flames. The aroma was rich and comforting. Alara watched him, still wrapped in the blankets. She felt awkward, exposed, and unsure of how to act. He was providing for his family, and she was just there. An intrusion. When the coffee was ready, he poured a mug for himself. He hesitated for a moment, then poured a second mug. He walked over to her and held it out. "Here," he said, his voice low. "Warm you up." Alara took the mug with trembling hands. The warmth seeped into her palms, a small comfort. "Thank you," she murmured again, looking up at him. In the growing light, she could see his face more clearly, strong jaw, tired eyes, a network of fine lines around them. He didn't look unkind, just guarded and weary. He nodded and retreated to the table, sitting down with his own mug. He didn't offer her food, and she didn't ask. She sipped the coffee slowly, savoring the heat and the bitter taste. It was the first thing she'd had to eat or drink since before the fire. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows, the children stirred. The girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, was the first down the ladder, her dark braids trailing behind her. She stopped when she saw Alara, her eyes wide. The boy, younger, perhaps 4, followed, rubbing his eyes. He clung to his father's leg, peeking out at the stranger by the hearth. The man introduced them quietly. "This is Sarah," he said, gesturing to the girl. "And this is Thomas." Alara managed a small, hesitant smile. "Hello, Sarah." "Hello, Thomas." Sarah didn't smile back, just stared. Thomas buried his face in his father's leg. The man didn't pressure them. He started preparing a simple breakfast, porridge and dried fruit. He served the children, then himself. He didn't offer Alara any. She understood. Supplies were likely scarce. She was an unexpected mouth to feed. She finished her coffee and placed the mug carefully on the hearth. She needed to make herself useful to earn her keep, however temporary it might be. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice still a little hoarse. The man looked up from his breakfast. He studied her for a moment, his gaze assessing. "Can you cook?" he asked. "Simple things," she replied. She'd worked in the boarding house, helped in the kitchen sometimes.
Vens calrots?
"Mend?" "Yes," she said. She was capable. She just needed a chance. He nodded slowly. "The dishes need doing," he said, indicating a stack of plates and bowls by the small wash basin. Water's in the bucket by the door. It was a small task, but it was a start. It was acceptance of a sort. She carefully folded the blankets, noting their rough texture and worn state. She set them aside and made her way to the wash basin. The water in the bucket was cold, but she didn't mind. Physical activity felt good after the paralysis of fear and cold. As she washed the dishes, she could feel the children's eyes on her. Sarah watched her movements, her expression thoughtful. Thomas still peeked from behind his father, but his initial fear seemed to be fading into curiosity. The man, whose name she still didn't know, ate his breakfast in silence, occasionally glancing at her, his expression unreadable. When she finished the dishes, she asked what else she could do. He had her sweep the floor, a packed earth floor that was surprisingly clean save for the mud she had tracked in. Then he sent her outside to chop kindling. He showed her where the wood was stacked and handed her a small axe, watching her carefully as she swung it. She wasn't strong, but she was methodical. The physical labor felt grounding, a way to focus her scattered thoughts. It felt good to be doing something, anything, instead of just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. She worked steadily, the rhythmic swing of the axe a balm to her frayed nerves. The sun was fully out now, warm on her back, drying the dampness from her hair and clothes, which were drying by the fire inside. She felt a small sense of accomplishment as the pile of kindling grew. It was a small contribution, but it was real. When she came back inside, dusty and tired but feeling a little more human, the cabin felt less alien. The children were playing quietly by the fire. The man was working on mending a leather harness at the table. He looked up as she entered. "That's enough for now," he said. "Water's warm for washing up." He gestured towards the wash basin, where a small kettle of water was steaming by the fire. He was pragmatic, direct. He offered help when needed, but expected contribution in return. There was no charity in his house, only necessity and mutual aid. It was a harsh code, perhaps, but it felt honest. As she washed her face and hands in the warm water, the grime of the past day washing away, she felt a sliver of something new, not hope, not yet, but a quiet sense of having found a temporary harbor in the storm. Days blurred into weeks. Alara settled into a rhythm, a silent negotiation of space and labor within the small cabin. She helped with the cooking, simple meals of beans, salt pork, and whatever vegetables they had preserved from the short growing season. She kept the cabin clean, washed their few clothes by hand, and helped fetch water from the well. The man, whose name she learned was Silas, didn't speak much. He spent his days working the land, tending to the small number of animals they had, a milk cow, a few chickens. His interactions were brief, functional commands or observations. Wood needs chopping, fence needs mending. The cow's not giving much today, but his silence wasn't dismissive. It was simply his nature. He watched her, his gaze steady and assessing, but he rarely commented. He saw that she worked hard, didn't complain, and was careful with his meager supplies. That seemed to be enough for him. The children, Sarah and Thomas, were her bridge to him. Sarah remained quiet and observant, but her initial wariness faded. She would watch Alara as she kneaded dough or mended clothes, sometimes asking a hesitant question about how she did it. Alara would answer softly, showing her the techniques, and Sarah would listen intently. Thomas, initially the most fearful, was also the quickest to trust. He would follow Alara around like a small shadow, his initial shyness replaced by a curious boldness. He would ask her endless questions in his small voice, about the fire, about the town, about where she came from. Alara answered what she could, carefully editing out the parts that were too painful or too complicated. She told them stories instead, old tales she remembered from her childhood, or made-up adventures that captured their imaginations. She braided Sarah's hair in new ways, taught Thomas simple songs, and helped them with the chores Silas assigned them. She found a quiet joy in their company, in their simple trust and affection. It was a salve to her wounded heart, a way to feel useful and connected after the devastating loneliness of her flight. Silas observed these interactions from a distance. He would watch Alara with the children, a subtle softening in his usually stern expression. He saw how they gravitated towards her, how her presence brought a lightness into the cabin that hadn't been there before. He never explicitly thanked her, but small gestures began to appear. He would leave a particularly smooth piece of wood for her kindling pile, or make sure the wash basin was filled with warm water for her hands after a cold day. He didn't offer conversation, but he offered quiet consideration. One evening, after the children were asleep, Silas was mending a tool by the firelight. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of his work. Alara was patching a worn shirt. The silence stretched between them, comfortable rather than awkward now. "You never said. What happened in Harmony Creek?" he said, his voice low. It wasn't an accusation, just a simple statement, an invitation. Alara hesitated. The memory of the fire was still raw, but there was also the unspoken question of why she had nothing, no belongings, no family mentioned. She couldn't tell him everything, not yet, but she could tell him about the fire. "It burned," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Everything. The whole town." She paused, choosing her words carefully. My home was there. Everything I had." She didn't mention the people she knew, the life she had, or the reasons she might have been particularly vulnerable or targeted even before the fire. "I just ran. There was nothing else to do." Silas nodded slowly, his eyes on his work. "Hard thing," he said. It was an understatement, but coming from him, it held more weight than elaborate sympathy. "Lost my wife 2 years back," he offered quietly, the first personal detail he had shared about himself. Sickness. Just after Thomas was born, Alara looked at him, seeing the lines of grief etched deeper into his face in the firelight. It explained the weariness, the solitude, the quiet burden he carried. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft. He shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "It's the way of things out here sometimes," he said, his gaze distant. "Hard on the kids." He didn't elaborate, but she understood. He was doing his best to raise them alone in this unforgiving land. His vulnerability, however brief and understated, created a new dimension to their fragile connection. It wasn't just about shelter and labor anymore. It was about two people, wounded by loss, trying to navigate a difficult world and protect the innocent lives entrusted to them. Their bond was growing, not through effusive conversation, but through shared silence, mutual observation, and the quiet, steady rhythm of survival. But the outside world was not as isolated as this cabin felt. Whispers traveled. News of the fire and perhaps rumors about those who had fled or those who were suspected of something. She knew her past was a shadow that could lengthen and threaten the fragile peace she had found here. The longer she stayed, the more attached the children became, the greater the potential disruption her presence could cause if the outside world came knocking. The harshness of the land was a constant threat, the coming winter, the unpredictable weather, the ever-present struggle for enough food and resources. But the human element, the potential for judgment and cruelty, felt even more menacing. She had found refuge, but was it a permanent one? Could she allow herself to believe in the possibility of belonging here, when her past was a ticking clock? The fragile peace of the homestead felt increasingly precarious as autumn deepened. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of a harsh winter. Resources were dwindling, and the daily struggle for survival intensified. More pressingly, the outside world began to encroach on their isolation. One afternoon, while Alara was helping Silas mend a section of fence, a rider appeared on the horizon. Silas straightened, his body tensing, his gaze fixed on the approaching figure. Riders were rare visitors to their remote cabin. As the rider drew closer, Alara recognized him, Jebediah Miller, a farmer from a settlement a few miles away, a man known for his nosiness and his judgmental tongue. He pulled his horse to a stop a short distance from them, his eyes immediately fixing on Alara. "Silas," Miller called out, his voice loud and carrying. "Heard you got yourself an extra hand." Silas didn't reply, just nodded curtly, his hand resting on the fence post, his posture defensive. Miller dismounted slowly, his gaze sweeping over Alara, taking in her worn, ill-fitting clothes, Silas's late wife's, which she now wore, and her wary expression. "Come from Harmony Creek, I hear?" Miller asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp and probing. The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications. News of the fire had clearly reached him, and perhaps more. Alara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. "She did," Silas answered before she could speak, his voice flat and unyielding. Miller stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly, though it was still loud enough to carry in the quiet afternoon. "Heard things," he said, glancing pointedly at Alara. "About folks from there, about who they were, what they might have been up to." Before the fire he paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "Heard the fire started. Sudden like. Some say it wasn't no accident." Alara's blood ran cold. They were talking about her or people like her. Rumors, accusations, the kind that could cling like burrs and ruin lives. She had fled one kind of destruction, only to find herself potentially facing another, the destruction of reputation. The social ostracism that could lead to something far worse in this isolated, unforgiving environment. "She needed shelter," Silas stated, his voice firm. "Storm was bad." "Storm passes," Miller said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "But some troubles, they follow you." Like a bad smell, he took another step closer, lowering his voice further. "Heard some folks from Harmony Creek weren't exactly honest folk. Some say they owed money. Some say they were hiding things." His gaze was fixed on Alara, challenging her, accusing her without saying the words outright. Alara felt a surge of anger, hot and unfamiliar. She was tired of running, tired of being judged for things she hadn't done, or for circumstances she hadn't controlled. But fear held her tongue. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Silas and the children. Her presence could bring trouble to their door. "She's been nothing but help here," Silas said, stepping slightly in front of Alara. A subtle but clear protective gesture. "Works hard. Good with the children." Miller chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Hard work ain't the same as good character, Silas. Folks talk. And folks are talking about Harmony Creek survivors." A skin questions, he looked at Alara again, his eyes narrowed. "Where were you exactly when that fire started? And what did you leave behind?" The questions were direct, laced with suspicion. Alara swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. How much could she say? How much should she reveal? "I was at the boarding house," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to keep it steady. "Working." The fire spread fast. There was no time to grab anything. Just run. It was the truth as far as it went. But it wasn't the whole truth of her life in that town, of the reasons she had been there alone, of the circumstances that made her vulnerable even before the flames erupted. Miller didn't look convinced. He stared at her for another moment, then turned his gaze back to Silas. "Just saying, Silas," he said, his voice returning to its louder, more casual tone. "Folks get twitchy about strangers, especially strangers from a place like that. Burnt to the ground. Makes you wonder what people were hiding." He chuckled again, a humorless sound. "Might be wise to know exactly who you're sheltering, for your own sake. And the kids." He mounted his horse slowly, never taking his eyes off Alara. Just something to consider with a final, lingering look. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Alara stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. His words were a clear warning, a threat disguised as neighborly advice. Her past had followed her. She looked at Silas, her expression apologetic, fearful. "I didn't," she began, unsure how to explain, how to mitigate the potential damage her presence was causing. Silas held up a hand, stopping her. He didn't look angry, but his face was grim. "He's just trying to stir up trouble," Silas said, though his tone lacked conviction. He knew Miller's type. Folks out here got nothing better to do than gossip. He turned back to the fence, picking up his tools, but the ease had gone out of his movements. He was troubled by Miller's visit, by the rumors. Alara knew he was. He hadn't asked her any more questions, hadn't demanded more answers. But the trust, so carefully built, felt suddenly fragile, threatened by the outside world's judgment. She had brought this potential conflict to his door. She felt a resurgence of the familiar despair, the feeling of being a burden, a source of danger. Maybe she should leave. Maybe it would be better for Silas and the children if she simply disappeared into the harsh landscape, taking her past and the potential trouble with her. But the thought brought a sharp ache to her chest. Leaving meant abandoning the tentative connections she had made, walking away from the first place that had felt remotely like a haven since the fire. It meant facing the wilderness alone again, with winter closing in. And the children. The thought of leaving Sarah and Thomas, who now ran to greet her with smiles and stories, was almost unbearable. Their safety, their well-being, suddenly felt intertwined with her own decision. Miller's visit cast a long shadow over the homestead. The easy rhythm of daily life was punctuated by a new tension. Silas was more withdrawn, his silences heavier. He didn't ask Alara more questions about Harmony Creek, but she felt his gaze on her sometimes, filled with unspoken contemplation. The children, thankfully, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents. They were her anchors, their simple presence a constant reminder of what she had found and what she risked losing. Winter arrived early and brutally that year. A blizzard swept in, burying the cabin under drifts and isolating them completely. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, shaking the cabin walls. The cold was bone-deep, seeping in through cracks in the logs. Their world shrank to the confines of the small cabin, warmed only by the fire and their shared breaths. This enforced isolation, ironically, helped to rebuild some of the bridges Miller's visit had threatened. They were forced into closer proximity, relying on each other for warmth, comfort, and survival. Alara proved invaluable during the blizzard. She was meticulous in conserving fuel, creative with their limited food supplies, and tireless in keeping the cabin as warm and dry as possible. She kept the children occupied with stories and games, distracting them from the biting cold and the isolation. One night, Thomas developed a fever. He coughed incessantly, his small body racked with shivers despite the blankets piled on him. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Silas was beside himself with worry. He was a man used to dealing with the harsh realities of the land, but sickness in his children terrified him. He sat by Thomas's bedside in the loft, his face pale and drawn, helpless. Alara saw his fear, the raw vulnerability beneath his stoic exterior. This was the father who had lost his wife, now facing the potential loss of a child. She knew a little about sickness, had helped nurse boarders through various ailments in Harmony Creek. She didn't have medicine, but she had knowledge. She boiled water, soaked cloths to cool Thomas's fevered brow, and mixed a soothing herbal tea from dried leaves she had gathered and identified before the first snow. She sat with Thomas through the long night, changing his cloths, coaxing him to sip the tea, her presence a quiet comfort to both the sick child and his anxious father. Silas watched her, his eyes weary but filled with a new kind of observation. He saw her competence, her quiet strength, her genuine care for his son. He saw that she wasn't just working for shelter. She was investing herself in the well-being of his family. As dawn broke, Thomas's fever finally broke. He fell into a deep, natural sleep, his breathing easing. Silas looked at Alara, his gaze holding a depth of gratitude that surpassed any words. "You saved him," he said, his voice rough with emotion. It wasn't an exaggeration. They both knew how quickly sickness could claim a child out here, isolated from help. Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest, different from the firelight. "We saved him," she corrected softly. "You kept him warm and safe. I just helped." It was a small distinction, but important. They had faced the threat together. The shared ordeal had forged a new link between them, one that felt stronger and more resilient than the tentative trust they had built before. In the days that followed, as Thomas slowly recovered, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The tension that Miller's visit had created began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet understanding. Silas started talking to her more, not just about chores, but about the farm, about the children, about his plans and worries. He spoke of his late wife sometimes, not with overwhelming grief, but with a gentle remembrance that allowed Alara a glimpse into the life he had lost and the burden he carried. Alara, in turn, felt able to share a little more of herself, though still carefully. She spoke of the simple things she missed from town, the sound of the bell in the church tower, the smell of bread from the bakery, a painful memory, the quiet company of other women. She didn't delve into the specific hardships or the reasons for her vulnerability, but she shared enough for him to see her not just as a refugee, but as a person with a past, with losses, with a quiet strength that had been tested. The children, sensing the shift in their father, became more openly affectionate towards Alara, calling her by name, seeking her out for stories and games. Sarah, in particular, began to confide in her, sharing her small worries and observations. Alara felt herself becoming, in a way she hadn't dared to hope, a part of their small family unit. She wasn't just the extra hand or the stranger who had sought shelter. She was Alara, someone who belonged, someone who contributed, someone who was needed. The blizzard eventually passed, leaving the world outside pristine and silent under a thick blanket of snow. The immediate threat of the storm was gone, and the internal tension had eased. But the external threat, the judgment and suspicion of the outside world represented by Miller, still lingered, waiting for the snow to melt and the roads to become passable again. They had faced the elements and sickness together, but the human element remained the most unpredictable and potentially dangerous challenge. She knew Miller hadn't forgotten about her, and when the snow melted, the world would come calling again. Spring arrived gradually, melting the snow and turning the landscape green again. The thaw brought mud, but also the promise of a new growing season and renewed connection with the outside world. This connection, however, brought with it the lingering threat that Miller represented. He visited again one sunny afternoon, riding up to the cabin with a deliberate air of purpose. This time he didn't stop at the fence. He rode right up to the cabin door, dismounting and tying his horse with an insolent air of ownership. Alara was outside, working in the small vegetable patch she had helped Silas plan and plant. Silas was nearby, mending a tool. Sarah and Thomas were playing by the steps. Miller's presence sent a jolt of unease through Alara. He hadn't come for idle chatter this time. His expression was set, determined. "Afternoon, Silas," Miller said, his voice lacking its usual false joviality. "Come to talk about that matter we discussed." Silas straightened slowly, his hand going instinctively to the axe handle leaning against the cabin wall. Alara moved closer to the children, a protective instinct surging through her. "What matter?" Silas asked, his voice low and steady, a clear warning underlying the simple question. Miller ignored the implied threat. He walked towards Alara, his gaze sharp and accusatory. "The matter of the woman you're harboring," he said, addressing Silas but keeping his eyes fixed on Alara. "Folks are still talking, Silas. More talking now that the roads are open. About how that fire might have started. About who might have had a reason for it to burn." He stopped a few feet from Alara. "And about folks who disappeared right after. Folks who owed money. Folks who weren't who they said they were." He looked Alara up and down, his lip curling slightly. "Seems peculiar, a woman tunnin' up out of nowhere with nothing but the clothes on her back, right after a fire like that." And from Harmony Creek, of all places, his words were sharp, cutting. The children had stopped playing, watching the exchange with wide, confused eyes. Sarah moved closer to Alara's side. "She's been here all winter," Silas said, stepping forward, placing himself between Miller and Alara. "Worked hard, helped with the children." "Maybe she worked hard to keep you from a skin. Too many questions," Miller sneered. "Maybe she helped with the children to make herself seem harmless." He turned his gaze back to Silas. "Truth is, Silas, there's a reward being offered for information about certain parties connected to the fire. And some of the talk is pointing to folks like her." He gestured dismissively at Alara. "People who had reason to see that town gone. Debts wiped clean. Tracks covered." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "A man could make a good sum, enough to make life easier out here. Enough to set yourself and the children up right." The implication was clear. He was offering Silas a way out, a way to profit from turning Alara in. It wasn't just judgment anymore. It was greed. Alara felt a wave of nausea. She had survived the fire, the storm, the winter, only to be faced with this, the possibility of being sold out like livestock. But even as fear gripped her, a fierce determination ignited within her. She would not be hunted, would not be defined by rumors and accusations. She had found a place here, tentative as it was. She had found a reason to fight. "I didn't start the fire," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through Miller's calculating words. She stepped out from behind Silas, facing Miller directly. "And I don't owe anyone anything. I lost everything in that fire, just like everyone else." Miller scoffed. "Easy to say. Hard to prove when you've got nothing." "My life before Harmony Creek was my own," Alara stated, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But I hurt no one. I ran from that fire because I was afraid, because I had nothing and nowhere to go. Not because I was guilty of anything." She looked at Silas, her gaze pleading not for protection, but for belief. Silas's expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on Miller. Miller laughed, a harsh, derisive sound. "Sounds like a story made up to fool a lonely man," he said, turning his dismissive gaze back to Silas. "You think you know her, Silas? You think a few months of chores and stories mean you know what she did? Or who she really is?" He took a step towards Silas, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "She's a stranger, Silas, from a burnt town with a bad name. Could be dangerous. Could be hiding something that'll bring trouble down on all your heads. That reward money." "Get off my land, Miller," Silas said, his voice quiet but laced with a cold fury Alara had never heard before. He took a step forward, his hand tightening on the axe handle. His eyes, usually weary, were hard as flint. Now Miller hesitated, clearly surprised by the sudden, unyielding resistance. He had expected Silas to be swayed by the money, or at least intimidated by the implications. "Silas, be reasonable," Miller began, but Silas cut him off. "I said, get off. I won't tell you again." His posture was resolute, protective. He wasn't just defending Alara. He was defending his home, his children, the fragile stability he had built, and the quiet connection he had forged. Miller saw the look in his eyes, the set of his jaw. He wasn't going to back down. Miller wasn't a fighter, just a bully and a gossip. He backed away slowly, his eyes narrowed in frustration and malice. "You're making a mistake, Silas," he spat. "Harboring someone folks are looking for could cost you everything. Remember that." He turned and walked quickly to his horse, his movements less confident than before. He mounted and rode away, not looking back, leaving behind a tense silence and the lingering smell of his ambition and resentment. Alara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Silas, her eyes filled with gratitude and a dawning sense of wonder. He had chosen to protect her. He had chosen to believe in her, or at least to defend her right to a place under his roof against the judgment of the outside world. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but deeply felt. He looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "Didn't do it for thanks?" he said gruffly, though his gaze was steady and reassuring. "Did it because Miller's a snake. And because, well, because you're here. This is your home now." The words hung in the air, momentous and unexpected. Your home now. It wasn't just shelter from a storm anymore. It was an offer, a statement of belonging. The children, sensing the tension had passed, ran to Silas, clinging to his legs. He put his arms around them, pulling them close. Alara looked at the three of them, Silas, Sarah, Thomas, and felt a sense of connection so profound it stole her breath. She had fled a burning town with nothing, lost everything she had ever known, faced storms both literal and figurative, and somehow, improbably, found something akin to a family, a place where she was seen, valued, and protected. Miller's threat still existed. The outside world's judgment was still a possibility, but facing it didn't feel impossible anymore. Not alone. Miller's departure left a stillness in the air, charged with the tension of the confrontation and the weight of Silas's words. "This is your home now." Alara stood by the small garden patch, the earth cool beneath her fingers, the afternoon sun warm on her face. The children, sensing the danger had passed, had returned to their play, their laughter a bright, clear sound in the quiet. Silas stood watching Miller ride away, his posture still vigilant. Alara looked at him, seeing him not just as the gruff homesteader who had offered her shelter, but as a man who had chosen to stand against external pressure, to defend a stranger based on her character within his home, not on the rumors whispered outside it. He turned back towards the cabin, his gaze meeting hers. There was a new expression in his eyes, less weary, more open. It wasn't romantic, not in the way of stories, but it was something deeper, a shared understanding, a mutual respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. The threat of Miller and the potential for judgment from the wider community still lingered, a cloud on the horizon, but within the boundaries of the homestead, something had shifted. The fear that had been a constant companion to Alara since the fire began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging and a fierce protectiveness towards this small, improbable family. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, contributing, and finding a sense of purpose in the daily routines of their lives. She helped Silas tend to the animals, learning about the rhythms of the farm. She worked alongside him in the fields, planting and weeding, her hands growing rough but strong. She continued to care for the children, teaching them, nurturing them, becoming a steady presence in their lives. They, in turn, had woven her into the fabric of their existence. Sarah shared her drawings and secrets with her. Thomas insisted Alara tuck him in at night and chase away the monsters from his dreams. They were not her children by blood, but they were hers in every other way that mattered. Silas included her in decisions about the homestead, where to plant, how to repair, when to trade in the nearest settlement. He sought her opinion, valued her perspective. Their conversations were still sparse, but they communicated with a glance, a shared look, an unspoken understanding that had grown between them over the long, isolated winter. One evening, sitting by the fire after the children were asleep, Alara finally told Silas more of her story. Not the salacious rumors Miller hinted at, but the truth of her life, the loss of her own family, the harsh circumstances that had led her to Harmony Creek, the quiet desperation of trying to make ends meet alone. She spoke of the dreams she had carried, the small hopes that had been extinguished by the fire. Silas listened in silence, his gaze steady, occasionally nodding. When she finished, the silence stretched for a moment, not awkward, but contemplative. "Hard road you've traveled," he said finally, his voice soft. "But you kept walking." It was his way of acknowledging her resilience, her strength. "You gave me a place to stop," she replied, looking at him, her heart full. He didn't reply, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly in a small, rare smile. The threat from Miller never fully disappeared. There were other instances of cold stares, pointed questions, the subtle ways a small community could make an outsider feel unwelcome, especially one carrying the shadow of suspicion from a place like Harmony Creek. But each time, Silas stood firm, his quiet defense of Alara unwavering. They faced it together, a united front. The homestead became their sanctuary, a world defined by their own rules of loyalty, trust, and mutual support, rather than the judgment of others. Alara was no longer the woman who had fled a burning town with nothing. She was Alara, part of this family, grounded in this land, her vulnerability tempered by a newfound strength forged in shared hardship and quiet connection. She had lost everything, but in the ashes and the storm, she had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for: a place to belong, a purpose, and a partnership built on the solid foundation of necessity and mutual respect. The future was still uncertain. Life on the frontier was always precarious. But as she looked out at the burgeoning life of the garden, at the small cabin that was now her home, at Silas and the children who were her family, she knew she wouldn't be facing it alone. She had come seeking shelter from a storm, and she had found a haven, not just for her body, but for her heart. The journey had been arduous, marked by loss and fear, but it had led her here, to a quiet clearing in the wilderness where resilience bloomed even in the harshest soil. This was not the life she had planned, but it was a life built on truth, on connection, and on the enduring strength of the human spirit to find light even after the deepest darkness. She was no longer just surviving. She was rooted, growing, and ready to face whatever came next, not with fear, but with a quiet, unwavering strength born of knowing she was finally home.